In the 90s and early 2000s, we were all about virtual pets. Everyone had them, everyone wanted them, from Tamagotchi to Furbies to robot dogs to our beloved Neopets. For as long as there have been kids, there have been parents saying no to getting a puppy. The dawn of the digital era finally gave them a way to say yes. Most people attribute the digital pet boom to Tamagotchi, the adorable egg-shaped pixel pet that bent its users to its will, beeping every 6 minutes for food and play and cleaning. But in 1995, the year before the Tamagotchi arrived on scene in Japan, a little company called PF Magic was predicting the craze and getting in on the ground floor with Petz, with a Z. This game would spark a huge online community, one of the first of its kind, with online adoption, breeding, and modding. 2 decades after the release of the first game, the Petz series would release its final game to an apathetic market, ignored even by the most die-hard of Petz fans. How did this happen? This is the story of Petz, its meteoric rise to cult status among virtual pet fans, and its plummet into the land of 3DS shovelware. Part 1. The Beginning. PF Magic was a game software company founded in 1991. Their initial project was a joint venture with Sega Genesis and AT&T called The Edge. The Edge was a cartridge that was going to allow for online multiplayer of Sega Genesis games over phone lines. One of these games was developed by PF Magic, Balls 3D, a funky little fighting game where the fighters were made entirely out of spheres. These spheres gave the appearance of 3D, and users would be able to use these weird little guys to fight each other online. Due to the cost of producing such a device, however, AT&T eventually pulled their funding for The Edge, leaving online gaming a dream for the future and PF Magic with half their original budget. This forced the company to look at other ventures, namely video games. Rob Fulop, one of the co-founders, was no stranger to video games. He had worked on some of the Atari 2600's biggest hits, including a well-received port of the arcade game Missile Command and Activision's arcade award-winning title Demon Attack. After leaving Atari and Activision, he branched out on his own. The Edge was far from Fulop's first attempt at pushing the envelope of gaming tech. Around the same time as founding PF Magic, he also worked with a company that was developing a game system called Control Vision. This system would have used VHS tapes for storage rather than traditional cartridges popular at the time. However, it proved to be too expensive for the consumer market and was never released. It took half a decade for the advanced games created by the system to be released. After the rise of CD-ROM, when Sega, looking for games for its new CDI system, came across the rights to some unused Control Vision games. Among them was Rob Fulop's game, which was about to become one of the most infamous video games of the century. You might have heard of it, Night Trap. A brief history for those who don't know. Night Trap was an FMV game, which means a full motion video game, so they would record actual video and use it as graphics in the game. In the game, the player is watching a number of security cameras, all placed strategically inside the rooms of a large house. The player is supposed to thwart an attempted attack on the innocent teenage victims having a slumber party inside the house. The player can trigger traps located all throughout the house, capturing and foiling the baddies creeping around inside. Though ridiculously cartoony by today's standards, the game created a massive controversy at the time for being incredibly sexual and violent, at least to the parents and lawmakers who were looking at it. In 1993, the US Congress convened a hearing to talk about the effects of video games on our youth, with the primary offenders being Mortal Kombat and Night Trap. The game was pulled from store shelves, and the Entertainment Software Rating Board, or the ESRB, was created in response. In 1993, Rod Fulop seemed somewhat disturbed by these claims of violence and sexualization, so he set out to create a video game that nobody could accuse of being harmful to children. The story goes that in order to figure out what kinds of video games kids would be interested in playing, he spoke to a mall Santa. The Santa told him that even in this day of high-tech toys and video games, the most commonly requested Christmas gift was still a puppy. And thus, it goes, that Dogs was born. PF Magic then used their earlier game, Balls 3D, as a base for their computer pups. While I haven't been able to find any discussion of the motivation behind using this system to create a dog figure, I can make a few guesses. In the early 90s, 3D graphics were still extremely primitive, and many computers did not have fully 3D capable graphics cards. The unique ball system created by PF Magic allowed the dogs to move around in somewhat realistic and varied ways, rather than having to pre-draw a sprite walk cycle, adding to the immersive simulation. And so, in 1995, the first game, Dogs, Your Computer Pet, was released for Windows desktop computers. The idea was simple. The pets explored a window in your desktop, running around, barking, and interacting with you. They could be played with and even trained with just the click of a mouse. In light of what was to come, it was an incredibly simple simulation. Still, the time was right. Funny little computer widgets were in, and at only $20 for the software, Dogs was a success. Not long after, PF Magic followed up with a sister game, Cats. This game was much the same, though there were a few added features like catnip and mice for the cats to chase, as well as some UI improvements. As I said before, these games were successful, but they were basically just widgets for your desktop. Many of the features that would come in later games didn't exist. There were only 5 breeds of each pet, and you could only have one out at a time. There was only one room for them to play in, and there was no integration between cats and dogs, so they couldn't interact with one another. And if you wanted to adopt more than one pet, then you needed to buy a second copy of the game. So very quickly, in the wake of their success, came Petz 2. Part 2. The Rise of Petz. Petz 2, released 1 year after the release of Cats, was a huge leap forward for both games, both graphically and in engineering. Users could adopt multiple pets and even play with 2 pets at one time. If users had a copy of both Dogs 2 and Cats 2, the dogs and cats could interact. The games could also be found packaged and sold together at a discount. The game added a number of features on top of allowing pets to play together. More toys, breeds, and tricks were introduced, allowing players to teach and play with their puppies and kitties with more depth. Personalities were also introduced. Before now, each breed kind of had a set personality, but in Petz 2, according to the box, no 2 pets are the same. I believe this was the game that also introduced the concept of pets running away. Because you could adopt as many new pets as you wanted, there was a disclaimer on the box that you could adopt as many pets as you could responsibly take care of. If you stopped taking care of your pets, then they would run away. This was actually considered a selling point for the game, as I learned looking back at the old PF Magic website on the Wayback Machine. By the time Petz 2 came out in 1995, had risen in popularity. The earliest versions of Tamagotchi were infamously difficult to care for. If users left their precious pile of pixels alone for too long, they might come back to a ghostly little angel hovering on the screen, letting them know that their digital friend had died. PF Magic did a poll on their website asking users if they thought their pets should die. The result of this poll was a resounding no. Attached to this poll is PF Magic's blog on the subject. They praised the fact that in their game, pets lived forever on your computer, and you and your child would never have to deal with the heartache of having lost a little buddy, digital or otherwise. However, as I said before, if you neglected to take care of your pets, they did run away. I don't know how this is supposed to be different, but okay. But either way, PF Magic hits the fact that your pets can't die pretty hard, so they obviously considered this a selling point. Speaking of the website, PF Magic was actually really ahead of the game here too. They used a website to grow their community, something that would end up defining the game in the long run. One thing that really helped spread the word of the Petz franchise was the generous demo program. Each version of Petz 2 came with a demo version that you could put on a floppy disk and give it to a friend so they could try out the game. This demo version was essentially a souped up version of the adoption center where you could try out different dogs or cats before you adopted them. If users liked the game or liked their little pet, they could purchase an activation code by phone, which would allow them to access the full version of the game. If they chose not to, they would have to close the program and destroy the little pets they'd grown close to while playing the demo. A little manipulative. That's also kind of prophetic for the way the video game industry would go. The website also released a number of special DLC breeds on their website for free. For about a year, they released a brand new cats or dogs breed every few months that users could download and put into their game. That made the website a go-to destination for the Petz community, which was growing steadily. And with the release of the next game, the online community would explode. So, in 1998, just a little over a year after Petz 2, Petz 3 was released. This game added in all of the DLC breeds packaged within the game, new locations for your pets to visit, clothing to dress up your pets, and, most importantly, breeding. Adult dogs or cats could breed with any other adult dog or cat of the opposite sex. So while interspecies breeding was not allowed, different breeds could go wild, creating a wide variety of new breeds. Back in the day, this was not a simple process. The pets in question had to be coaxed to fall in love, and after that, randomly, the user would receive a message that their pets were expecting a puppy or a kitten. After a few real-world days of pregnancy, the infant would be born, and from there, they had to be raised and trained just like adopted pets. This, kind of blew up the community. Before, players could share photos of their pets and show off their cool tricks, but for the most part, there was very little variation between adopted pets. But now, players could create their own special little babies, breeding for the colors, coat types, and even tails they liked best. Users could also share their pets files, adopting out those puppies and kittens that they were less interested in. The official website encouraged this, creating an entire section of the website dedicated to classifieds for adoptables, sires and dames for breeding, and even pet shows to show off your unique and special creations. Even outside of the official website, members of the online pets community started creating their own websites. This was encouraged by the devs who packaged a website creation tool with Petz 3. Some of these were kennels and catteries that specialized in user-created breeds. Many of these were bred from official breeds within the Petz games, utilizing the random mutations that sometimes occurred to create distinct breeds that users could adopt and download for their own games. A growing number of players, however, began editing the code files for the pets, a practice that was known as hex editing. I'm not going to go too deeply into hex editing, mostly because I tried to get into it in middle school and I found it so frightening and overwhelming that I'm still a little scared of it to this day. I mean, look at this. Hexadecimal stuff, it's just so intimidating. Essentially, though, this was the practice of hacking or modding the code of particular pet or breed files. Each block of hex code corresponds to a particular part of the pet. Some parts correspond to joints or limbs made up of the iconic balls of the series. Users could move, resize, and recolor the different balls or the lines that attach them. Hex editing could be as simple as changing the color of the inside of a pet's ear or their eyelids to something as extreme as completely changing their anatomy. As these types of pets became more popular, more and more people started editing their pets in more extreme ways. While some people were satisfied with just making existing dog breeds that did not exist in the game, some folks decided that they wanted more representation for other animals, fantasy creatures, or even their own original creations. These became known as hex breeds, and they would only become more popular as time went on. Petz 4 was, again, released just about a year after the release of Petz 3. If all of this sounds really fast, like a game a year or so, that's because it was. And while the quick release of Petz 3 after Petz 2 makes a lot of sense when you look at all the stuff that they added, Petz 4 kind of starts to look a little bit like a cash grab. That's not to say that it's a bad game. In fact, it's the most popular Petz game even to this day. If someone is looking to get into the community, Petz 4 is by far the easiest to find and the one that most people are working with. But for the most part, it didn't have that much to add. What it did add was more locations, new breeds, and more costumes, as well as supposedly voice recognition for your animals who could learn to respond to their own names and do tricks on command. Although I was never able to get it working, so for me, that part's all theoretical. Some of the new locations were pretty cool, and they added NPC pets that would sometimes appear in the different locations, which I guess was neat. But as far as the pets community was concerned, I guess one of the best additions in the games was the addition of non-dog and cat animals. Dogs and cats each added a separate animal, with cats adding rabbits and dogs adding pigs. These non-cat or dogs animals proved to be important in the hexing community, who still hadn't worked out some of the more complex AIs of the pets. See, the AI in the pets games is unique. The team set out to create the illusion of life, and they did this through a number of deliberate choices. I don't have time to get into all of them now, but Gamasutra has a transcript of a 1998 GDC presentation that I recommend if you're interested in learning more, that I'll link below. The Petz AI works on what one of the devs called an adjective-based system. Basically, things get tagged with different attributes. For example, food items might be tagged tasty or nutritious. A hungry pet may be attracted to a food item that is tasty, but unless it is also nutritious, it won't fill up the pet's hunger bar. The exact workings of the system were unknown and fairly mysterious until recently, when a user reached out to a dev on Twitter and found out most of this information. The pets community was rocked with the knowledge that pets actually did have a preference for certain toys based on their color or texture, for example. Before this, people had seen it sort of anecdotally, but they didn't know if they were just like making it up in their heads that their dog preferred one ball to another, for example. All this to say that back in the early 2000s, our knowledge of the AI was still in its infancy, which meant that you could create a unique fantasy unicorn breed and it might look like a unicorn, but if you used the Great Dane as the base, it would still behave like a Great Dane. It would bark like a Great Dane. It would run after balls like a Great Dane. This is obviously very frustrating if you're trying to create a realistic unicorn. The rabbits proved to be a pretty good answer for that because they didn't bark or make any kind of unique noises, and they didn't do things like get excited when seeing a frisbee. But aside from all that other stuff, probably the most notable thing about Petz 4 is that it was the final game developed by PF Magic. PF Magic had been bought by the Learning Company, and soon things were about to change. Things that would often be pointed to when talking about Part 3, The Downfall of Petz. In the years following the Learning Company purchase, the online community was still thriving, but you wouldn't know it by looking at the official website. When the Learning Company took over PF Magic, they decided that the classified section of the website was not worth hosting anymore. The game still encouraged the online community building it always had, with the game still releasing with website builders, but it was clear that if the community wanted more, they were going to have to go and get it themselves. In 2001, the Learning Company sold its non-core entertainment division to Ubisoft, who took hold of the Petz franchise. 1 year later, in 2002, Petz 5, the final Petz of the PC Petz era, came out to mixed reviews. On the surface, Petz 5 actually looks like a really good sequel. 5 new breeds of each animal were released, meaning 10 new breeds in total were added, and probably more important to the community, this game added litters. No longer would your pet be forced to produce only one puppy or kitten at a time. Instead, they could randomly produce 1 to 4 offspring each pregnancy. But the game itself was overall not very well received. Though it was a PF Magic style game, they didn't work on it. It proved very difficult to run for some people, and it was buggy and glitchy. The new breed models were also not considered up to the standards of older breeds, including those of the free DLC that were released back in the Petz 2 days. Overall, the community felt as though the game was being mishandled by its new owners and publishers. But you know how fandoms can be. Despite feeling let down by the company, the community stayed active. They continued to produce new breeds and play the pet games and their spinoffs, including Babies, which was released some years earlier. I didn't mention it before, and I really don't have time to go into Babies, but I just wanted to say I love this game and it's completely fascinating to me, so I had to bring it up. And while the community continued to thrive, the games just stopped. Of course, for most franchises, a break of a couple of years is not a huge deal, but PF Magic had been putting out one of these games about once a year for so many sequels that it was unusual for there to be a drought like this. It seemed as though without PF Magic at the wheel, Ubisoft was unsure what to do with the rights of the franchise they had bought. And unfortunately, the quality of the games would sharply plummet with the release of the first Petz game post the Ubisoft purchase. It was kind of a perfect storm. In the mid-2000s, we saw something of a boom of shovelware. For myriad reasons, the ease of release on consoles like the Nintendo Wii, the Nintendo DS, and Xbox Live enabled a deluge of shoddily made minigame factories with minimal thought and effort put into their creation in an attempt to put out as many of these titles as possible. If you lived through this era, you know exactly what I'm talking about. Well-meaning grandmas would pick up these games in the checkout line of the Walgreens, it's that sort of thing. Then the release of the massive hit Nintendogs in 2005 must have made Ubisoft take a second look at this pet-based franchise that it had purchased. 3 months after the release of Nintendogs on the Nintendo DS, Ubisoft published Dogs and Cats for the Game Boy Advance. This actually wasn't the Petz franchise's first time on a portable game system. A few years earlier, PF Magic had published Cats and Dogs for the Game Boy Color. That game was based on the earlier games in the series, and it wasn't great. I mean, it's cute, but there's a reason that I didn't mention it before now. The new Dogs and Cats games for the GBA were different. For example, unlike the PF Magic games, the Dogs and Cats games weren't actually the same game. Like, the PF Magic Cats and Dogs were basically the same game but with different animals, and that's not what was happening with this GBA version. Even though they were similar in some ways, they were very distinctly different games. Dogs for the GBA was released first, and is unsurprising if you look at the release of Nintendogs just a few months earlier, which Ubisoft was presumably trying to capitalize on. They were able to put out a game so fast because they did something they would continue to do for basically all of the rest of the Ubi Petz games: reach into a catalog of unlocalized Japanese games and publish it under the Petz banner. So, Video Game History Corner. Somewhat famously, the version of Mario 2 that was released in North America wasn't really a Mario game at all. It was a game called Doki Doki Panic, which Nintendo reskinned and released as Mario 2 here in the States because they thought that we were all filthy casuals who couldn't handle the real Mario 2. Which is true, they were right, because that game is brutal. That's kind of what happened here. Dogs GPA was released in Japan under the name Kawaii Koinu, part of the Nakayoshi Pet series. This game has a distinctly Japanese or anime-inspired art style. Instead of a disembodied hand, players control a kid who interacts with other characters as well as a dog that they adopt. This has a kind of RPG feel to it, with time passing within the game through the actions that players make instead of in real time. Players are meant to raise their pet's stats through training and care. This goal-oriented game proved very different from the openness and self-guided gameplay of the PC PF Magic games. Cats for the GBA followed quickly, and while there were some minor gameplay differences, the idea was mostly similar. It was stat building, it was RPG-like, you get the idea. But this was just the beginning. In 2006, in an interview with Gamasutra, Ubisoft's executive producer Tony Van talked about their plans moving forward. Van claimed that November would see a ton of new titles in the Petz brand: Dogs PC, Cats PC, Horses PS2, and Hamsters Life DS. This seemingly jumbled mix of titles and platforms was, in his words, a strength, as it would allow more people to play the games. Of course, if they were drawing from a back catalog of already created Japanese games, that might have played a role as well, though he failed to mention that. When asked if this diversification would weaken the franchise, Van said, "The only thing that wears a franchise is when it stops meeting the expectations of the consumer." This interview would prove to be prophetic. Over the next few years, Ubisoft would dump these games into the market. Hamsters, Horses, Horses 2, Monkeys, Pets Wildlife Vet, Pets Fantasy. And look, I'm not trying to put these games on blast. I mean, I guess I am, just a little, but while I personally consider these mostly shoddily made knockoffs turned around for a quick buck by Ubisoft, that doesn't mean they were totally without value. They were created in Japan to be their own series. It's not their fault that the Petz name was put on them. They weren't Petz games. They weren't the games the existing community really wanted. These games, while always serviceable and fun for younger audiences, were shallow simulations, more goal-oriented than creativity-focused, and lacked the charm that had drawn in the millions of Petz players to the franchise before. While I have no doubt that many people have fond memories of these games, those who hoped for more games like the PF Magic ones were left behind as Ubisoft found a new audience. With the sunsetting of the Nintendo DS and 3DS, which became the main hub for these games, the Ubi Petz games have died down. I think there's a lot of reasons for this, not just that Nintendo isn't supporting their old handhelds anymore. The money just isn't in shovelware for kids anymore. It's like more in mobile games and stuff like that. The more recent games, Petz Beach and Petz Countryside, were released in 2014. While there are no reviews from game critics that I could find, the game received pretty good reviews from players, which I think is a nice way to end things. Except things didn't end, because the Petz community never really went away. Even though they had been left behind by Ubisoft, they didn't turn their backs on the original Petz games from the 2000s. They found ways to play the older games on their newer computers, even making improvements with mods like Petz, which adds features like instant breeding and the ability to bring out as many pets as a user wants instead of just 2. While popularity waned, it never disappeared entirely. Over time, websites changed, from LiveJournal to Tumblr, from GeoCities to Wix. Some sites, like the Petz auction page, disappeared and were replaced with new ones, like the flea market, where users can bid on cool hexes that people are creating. As technology and understanding of the game changed, so did the modding community. Editing and making cool pets is now easier than ever with third-party tools, understandable even for a scrub like me. There are also those who create their own breeds naturally, doing minimal or no hex editing to create their own special dog or cat breed pure, using just the breeding technology in the game. I am constantly impressed by the amount of work and time that goes into breeding hundreds of generations of these animals, even with the aid of something like Petz. When I decided to look into the community for this video, I expected to find a loyal but tiny group of hangers-on, an admirable group of fans keeping the game on life support. But I was so wrong. There are quite a few of them, and they are breathing new life into this game, constantly learning new things and teaching others what they've learned. It's nostalgic, but it's also fun and joyful and fresh. One of the first things I saw when I looked into this, exploring the existing community, was a post taking a fandom census. They wanted to get the pulse of the community to prove to Ubisoft that it was worth releasing the code for Petz, so that modders could do even more with the series. Since the game is basically abandonware, it's not hard to get your hands on it, but the community wants the code to really understand how things tick. They want to make improvements and changes to the decades-old game, and Ubisoft has precedent for something like this. With Ubisoft's permission, PF Magic developers could release the code that they still have, allowing the community to grow and continue for years to come. So I was wrong. And while the Petz franchise may have looked like it fell, it's still around. It's far from gone. I hope those of you who found this interesting will continue to look into this really cool community and maybe check it out yourself. And that's it. Real quick, I just wanted to say thank you so much for 5,000 subs. That iceberg video did better than I ever could have imagined, and I hope that all of you who subbed from it found this at least mildly entertaining. And to everyone who got this far in this video, thank you so much. Thanks so much for watching, and I hope you have a great day.